There is no war without propaganda. It produces images of the enemy, stirs up fear, feelings of revenge, and guilt. It fights with exaggerations, with slogans and lies. Its weapons are the mass media. The power of moving pictures, initially tested in the First World War. Radio and film with sound gave propaganda completely new possibilities.
Amerikanische Sherman-Panzer brechen in ein von Infanteristen und Fallschirmjägern gehaltenes Dorf ein. Ein deutscher Kriegsberichter filmt den Panzereinbruch aus unmittelbarer Nähe.
Television brings war into living rooms.
Good morning, greeting to the Viet Cong for the B-52.
In the age of the internet, it is not the lack of, but the abundance of information that makes it easy for propagandists and difficult for the truth. In Vietnam, the U.S. waged a war that could hardly be surpassed in terms of brutality. More than 3 million Vietnamese were killed, including many civilians. Almost 60,000 U.S. soldiers died in the supposed fight for the freedom of the West.
We have learned at a terrible and a brutal cost that retreat does not bring safety, and weakness does not bring peace.
The memories of World War II were also reflected in the public portrayal of the Vietnam War. Hardly any reporter questioned the necessity of U.S. involvement.
It is certainly common to all of them that they were very much driven by the idea that they could enlighten through their reporting.
The majority of Americans considered it a duty to defend democratic values even in Vietnam. The danger of losing more states to communism was too great.
The first 100,000 American troops that came in, I would interview them, and they believed that fighting Ho Chi Minh and helping the South Vietnamese was a worthy cause. It was only when the going got really tough and many Americans started to die that they realized that it was not worth sacrificing their own lives for a cause that could not be gained.
Vietnam was considered the first and only war without censorship. In the early days, this wasn't necessary, a phenomenon that doesn't exist today when conflicts begin.
Journalists regulated themselves. There is this proverbial rally around the flag ethos. As soon as a war starts where criticism of the soldiers is not allowed, then it works to a large extent.
War entered the living rooms of the world for the first time via television screens. The impact of the new mass medium was still untested.
At Fort Monmouth, combat television takes another big step into the future as men of the Signal Corps prepare to demonstrate the Army's new, fully portable TV camera.
The television audience was horrified to see that the official portrayal of a neat war hardly corresponded to the images on television.
To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past.
The Vietnam War drove a deep wedge into American society.
It seems ironic that while our finest young men are fighting halfway across the world, other young men and women, safe at home, openly advocate abandonment of Vietnam to communism. Perhaps they really don't know what this war is all about.
As public protests grew, the media's image of the war also changed. Television now sided with the opponents of the war. The American government came under pressure. Continuing the war could no longer be justified. Two years after the official withdrawal of troops, the world watched as the U.S. suffered one last major defeat in Vietnam. The U.S. Embassy in Saigon had to be abandoned.
First signal I sent to Win Till, and after that signal, 13 days till go. And the second signal I sent to American. And after I send a signal, 24 hours, the American go.
The Vietnam War was over for the U.S. The images remain, as does the myth that the media were to blame for the outcome of the war, a myth with far-reaching consequences for the future treatment of war correspondents.
Politicians and the military said that you hindered us in Vietnam. We will not allow ourselves to fight again with one hand tied behind our backs, and we will take measures to restrict you so that this doesn't happen.
Starting in 1945, Vietnam, a country with a population of almost 30 million, became the site of a 30-year-long war. For the hostile great powers in the Cold War, the strategically unimportant agrarian state was initially only a minor element in the global political struggle between East and West.
The fact is that Vietnam was a marginal place from the U.S. perspective for a long time, to the extent that the conflict in Vietnam was no longer seen as a colonial war, but was reinterpreted as a theater of the Cold War, was how the United States became involved. And accordingly, for a long time, the media didn't talk about Vietnam. That changed the moment the U.S. role changed.
What began as financial support for a European ally turned into a crusade against communism after the electoral victory of the communists in China and the beginning of the Korean War. After the partition of Vietnam in 1954, the U.S. took over protection of the Western-oriented South and sent so-called military advisors into the country. The conflict went unnoticed for a long time in public. One of the few reporters there at the time was Stanley Carnow.
I was in Vietnam on July 8th, 1959, when the first 2 Americans were killed. I couldn't possibly have imagined that these were the first 2 of 60,000 Americans who would get killed, or that they were the beginning of 3.5 million Vietnamese who would get killed. I wrote a story that appeared in about 2 or 3 paragraphs. It was just a minor incident.
At the end of 1960, various communist groups founded the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam, or NLF for short. The insurgents were disparagingly called Viet Cong by their opponents, which meant Vietnamese communists. In a U.S. government propaganda film, the NLF fighters were depicted as bloodthirsty assassins who terrorized their own people.
The native population, persuaded by false promises or stricken with terror, becomes the enemy's human shield. And too often, the stolen fruits of their hard labor become the enemy's principal line of supply. A war fought in the territory of our friends, the Vietnamese, with supplies and conscripts drawn from their own people to last as long as necessary to exhaust them from within.
After Truman and Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, a man inexperienced in foreign policy, walked onto the political stage. In 1961, he became president, and the conflict in Vietnam became the focus of the young head of state. Expectations of the new strongman in the White House were high.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
Vietnam was far away, an unknown country. Secretary of Defense McNamara sounded out the situation and was convinced after a few days they were winning the war. Future CNN reporter Peter Arnett traveled to Vietnam on behalf of a news agency. For him, it was the beginning of a great career.
No one had any idea in '62 that this would turn into a major war. And it seemed unlikely that the Viet Cong insurgency could develop into a major conflict.
Hoping for an early victory, Kennedy increased the number of U.S. military advisors sent earlier by Eisenhower. They were to train the South Vietnamese army to fight against the guerrillas.
With skills and tactics developed by United States Special Forces experts, Vietnamese Rangers now can match the enemy at his own game.
By the end of '63, as many as 16,500 American so-called military advisors were on the ground. They were not in the public eye. That changed when doubts arose whether the advisors were really only advising, at which point journalists said, they're flying the plane, they're not just sitting in it. Or there was a famous scene where an American reporter was sitting with an American official in Saigon, and an aircraft carrier was passing in the background, and the journalist was flabbergasted and said, "Look at the aircraft carrier." And the official turned vaguely in that direction and said that he didn't see anything.
In the Battle of Ap Bak, south of Saigon in early 1963, it became clear for the first time that North Vietnam's guerrilla forces were able to defend themselves even against a numerically far superior enemy. The U.S. military had to watch as the communist enemy escaped. South Vietnamese troops had ignored orders from U.S. military advisors. Reporter Peter Arnett recalls his report at the time.
Ap Bak became a symbol and inspiration for future battles, because for the first time the Viet Cong had stood and fought and won. There'll be a big groan across veteran America. Goddamn communist simp. Arnett's back.
Reports like Arnett's were hardly noticed by the public at first. In the U.S. government, however, they were. President Kennedy even tried to persuade editors to dismiss overly critical reporters. Young journalists, in particular, were denied the ability to make judgments.
They didn't have the experience of the world wars, and that made them vulnerable. That made them vulnerable in the US because it was said young people don't know what war is. They can't assess what's happening, and we can't rely on their judgment. That changed the moment they were awarded for their work. The Pulitzer Prizes in '64, '65, and '66 for reporting on Vietnam were enormously important. First of all, for the international discussion about the Vietnam War, and of course also with a view to the hierarchy on the ground.
Protests by Buddhists in Saigon in June 1963 provided the occasion for the first award-winning reporting on Vietnam, and at the same time triggered a discussion about the role of journalists. To draw further attention to the brutal repression by ruler Diem, Buddhist monks decided to set themselves on fire. Malcolm Brown's photo was awarded a Pulitzer Prize. Many journalists were on the scene. They had received a tip beforehand.
He got out of a taxi, he poured liquid on himself and lit a match, and he went out and smoked right before my eyes.
This was an important moment for the Vietnam War and for the discussion of the role of journalists, because people said, why didn't Peter Arnett, why didn't the other colleagues on the ground help these monks?
I just took a couple of pictures and went off to file the story, followed by security people who started hitting me, and they attacked the other reporters. They tried to take our film, they kicked them, they shoved them, they injured a couple, they arrested a couple. My instinct was to take the picture and get it out, and to get the story out. I wasn't a photographer, but I took a lot of pictures. We all did. And my instinct was to get the story out, because this was a political immolation, it was a political suicide. You know, if I had attempted to prevent it, then if I had prevented him killing himself, the security police would have wrapped him up and probably killed him in their own security cells. I didn't feel that I should intervene in that.
Some wanted to convey the immediate experience, which had been possible more than before, especially since television reporting came into existence. Photographers had this very strong ethos, but without being politically pro or con. That was not appropriate.
The coverage had an impact. Even President Kennedy was affected. No other news picture had aroused as much emotion as that one. The U.S. government acted and supported a military coup in South Vietnam. Head of state Diem was deposed and found murdered shortly thereafter. A military junta temporarily took over the government. In November 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. He was killed by 2 rifle shots at an election campaign event in Dallas. The attack triggered national trauma in the U.S. Only a few hours later, his successor was sworn in. Former Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, a rough-around-the-edges Texan with no international experience, took office. Shortly thereafter, he too declared his support for a continuation of the war in Vietnam.
Most of the non-communist nations of Asia cannot by themselves and alone resist the growing might and the grasping ambition of Asian communism. Our power, therefore, is a very vital shield. If we are driven from the field in Vietnam, then no nation can ever again have the same confidence in American promise or in American protection.
The U.S. Navy had long since taken up position off the coast of Vietnam. Again and again, minor incidents occurred. In August 1964, an alleged attack on the destroyer Maddox provided the justification for American airstrikes on North Vietnamese naval bases and port facilities. The U.S. government wanted to demonstrate its strength.
Renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
3 days later, Congress passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, effectively a declaration of war and a blank check. Historians have long since agreed that the incident was faked, as is so often in history, and the following justifications were also old propaganda tools.
We wish to emphasize we seek no wider war. Our response will depend upon the action of the aggressors, in this case the North Vietnamese. The key to the situation remains the cessation of infiltration from the north into the south.
The Marines who went ashore in Vietnam were confident of victory, but the situation was extremely critical. The government in Saigon was increasingly losing its moral authority. U.S. soldiers were not used to fighting in the jungle. For the civilian population, the bloody civil war in their country was an unimaginable tragedy. For the Americans, it was the beginning of a military nightmare.
The war in Southeast Asia is an unusual kind of war. There are no front lines here. The elusive enemy can appear as villagers or farmers. To find out what is going on in unfriendly territory, it takes men on the ground.
From the start, the war was well documented. The Army employed its own film crews and photographers. What the Army published was censored. Most of the footage was often only released from the archives decades later. Footage from the war correspondents, on the other hand, went all around the world.
War reporting traditionally comes from travel reporting, from adventure reporting. And many journalists who reported from Vietnam tended to understand their role in that sense. At least until they arrived in Vietnam. That was the folly for many journalists who came to Vietnam, expecting it to be an exotic place that promised adventure.
Peter Arnett, too, found reporting from an exotic crisis zone more appealing than anything else.
So I'm interested about conflict as the phenomenon that it is. It's so much a measure of what a country is. Histories are measured by their wars. Vietnamese talk about history, and they're talking about the times the Chinese invaded, the times the French invaded, and the American war. They're not talking about terms of peace, they're talking about terms of war. So I get excited by wars because I know that it's history happening before my eyes.
Reporters were often on the road with the troops, sharing daily life and being fed, transported, and provided with accommodation. For a long time, they were allowed to report on the war in Vietnam without any government supervision.
In Vietnam, there was no censorship. There were no checks on what we did. If you wanted to go into a battle in Vietnam, you went down to the black market in Saigon, and you bought yourself a helmet and a pair of boots and whatever else you needed, and you went out to the airport, and you saw the helicopters going off to battles, and you just went up to one of the helicopters, one of the officers, "Can I come along?" "Sure," he says, "come on along." And you jump on, you go, right?
The number of journalists in Saigon rose to several hundred. Never before and never again would there be so much freedom of movement for newspaper reporters, photographers, and cameramen as in Vietnam.
There were directives for the American representatives on the ground, but the possibilities for American institutions to intervene were relatively small.
Eingreifend zu wirken, waren relativ gering.
First, because it wasn't US territory, and second, because the options available, especially when war had not been declared, were few.
Starting in 1966, Welsh photographer Philip Jones Griffiths reported from Vietnam for the famous Magnum Photo Agency. The relationship between the military and the media, in his experience, had long been untroubled.
In the beginning, everyone, or every American, I think, and probably every journalist and photographer there, believed in the war, not just in the morality of the war, but the way the war was, the tactics of the war. And they were only too pleased to see you there. You were given as much access as you wanted. It was not quite as good as a Playboy bunny coming from a part of the USO entourage, but certainly, you know, a good photographer who could talk a bit and tell stories about the pop stars that he'd photographed. I mean, it was, you know, it livened things up. They were welcoming, very welcoming.
The U.S. Marines have also taken center stage in South Vietnam. No longer a defensive force at the Da Nang Air Base, they have been ordered to fan out on a wide perimeter to flush out rebel Viet Cong positions. On land and afloat, they patrol around the clock, and for the time being at least, these forays seem to have put an end to communist night raids on the strategic air base.
That communism posed a threat that justified the deployment of U.S. soldiers in Southeast Asia was not questioned by anyone in the late 1960s.
Das war die Zeit des Kalten Kriegs und dort gab es
That was the time of the Cold War, and there was the moral compulsion, which also resonated very widely in the media, to choose one's own side. That is, the American side, the Western side. And that shaped the coverage of the war. That is, the kind of war for one's own cause was the good one, and the others were the bad ones.
Heroic U.S. Marines in action. But the fact that the war had caused the suffering and death of Vietnamese civilians from the very beginning had long been ignored by the American media. Right from the start, in the official press releases of the U.S. government, one message above all was aimed at the American public. We, the U.S., are winning this war. Contrary to expectations, combat strength and the toughness of the enemy was hardly a topic of discussion. Here's a press statement by President Johnson's National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy.
And I think it's fair to say that the Americans in Vietnam are in very good heart and are prepared to continue even against this kind of danger and this kind of sneak attack.
The war in Vietnam had become a major public issue. But still, the majority of Americans believed that the mission in Vietnam was just and necessary. But the number of opponents of the war was steadily growing.
Anti-war demonstrators protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War in mass marches, rallies, and demonstrations.
The images from Vietnam, more often than not, did not square with official pronouncements. Critical voices were growing louder, especially in the American civil rights movement. Nobel Peace Prize winner Martin Luther King had already found his voice by the beginning of 1967.
Civil rights leader Martin Luther King leads the procession to the United Nations, where he urges UN pressure to force the U.S. to stop bombing North Vietnam.
This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's homes and with orphans and widows, of sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields, physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death.
Increasingly, journalists were also describing the other side of the war: death, flight, children crippled by mines and shells, villages wiped off the map, and disillusioned GIs. For the first time, the pictures documenting the unspeakable suffering and horror in Vietnam were appearing on front pages. Until then, many editors had shied away from such stories. They did not want to scare their readers. But many photographers were beginning to side with the victims.
I had a personal rule, which was that I never lied. You know, if somebody said to me, "What do you think of this war?" You know, I would say, "Well, not much. I think you guys are going to lose." You know, so. But one of the wonderful things about Americans, they don't say, "Well, you know, get out of here," or "I'm calling in a chopper to get you out." They'd say, "Hey, come and sit with us. Tell us why you think the way you think." You know. Now, of course, that changed. So that, you know, in '66, that's what it was like, and into '67. But after Tet, then, of course, it was so different.
In early 1968, images of a massive surprise attack by the Viet Cong shocked the American public. In the so-called Tet Offensive, the communist guerrilla units temporarily took parts of Saigon and advanced as far as the presidential palace, despite 500,000 U.S. soldiers being stationed in South Vietnam. Renowned CBS newsman Walter Cronkite put into words the horror of an entire nation.
To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion. But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.
Almost everywhere in the country, the Viet Cong had to admit defeat after fierce fighting that lasted only a few days. Militarily, the guerrillas suffered a defeat, but politically, the offensive was a success for the communists.
The
1968 Tet Offensive was considered by many to be the turning point of the Vietnam War. By the time it took place, the shift in opinion in the U.S. toward opposing a war in Vietnam had already begun, and Tet was the event when it became obvious that the war couldn't be won.
In the Tet Offensive alone, the Viet Cong lost 2/3 of their fighters, more than 50,000 men, but that did little to change the enemy's resilience.
We were up against an enemy that was prepared to take unlimited losses. And they took tremendous losses, tremendous. Maybe, we don't know. 3.5 million Vietnamese were killed. Maybe half of those were military, the others were civilians. You could go to a battlefield after a battle in Vietnam and see these piles of dead bodies. And the American official comment, though, is, see, we're making progress, we're killing them. We're going to break their morale. They can't possibly go on like this. And yet they did.
After a few days, calm returned to the capital, Saigon. The shock from the unexpected and violent wave of attacks ran deep.
The key point about Tet was the psychological component, and that's what came through in the reports. We had, in the course of the Tet Offensive, a series of images, events, sayings that now occupy essential places in our cultural memory.
Shortly after the start of the Tet Offensive, the Saigon police chief shot a Viet Cong fighter in front of television cameras and photographers. That moment was captured by American photographer Eddie Adams. His record of the killing of an alleged murderer still has an impact today.
When I took the picture, I thought nothing of it. Somebody blows somebody's fucking head off. That's what war is. I had no idea what was going to happen or whatever.
What happened?
Well, the whole world changed. The picture was used for every demonstration, clear demonstration. People say, not me, people say this end to help end the war in Vietnam. If that did, then that's pretty cool.
Like the Tet Offensive during the war, Adams's photo is considered a turning point in public perception of the war, part of the reason for the creation of the myth about the power of the media.
That's
one of the most important and consequent myths about the Vietnam War, that the media, whatever the media is that the media caused support on the ground in the United States to crumble, and crumble to the extent that the war could not continue successfully.
Adams' photo became a symbolic image for opponents of the war, but a withdrawal of troops was still a long way off.
Media has an impact on how a war is perceived, without question. But to end a war, it takes more than reporting. It takes the political will. It takes the means to do so. And it takes strategies to end that war.
President Johnson brought social reforms to his country while plunging it into the deepest social crisis since the American Civil War. He would not run again.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
His successor was Richard Nixon, who was regarded as an unpredictable hardliner. He promised to take office with a peace plan for Vietnam.
Never has so much military, economic, and diplomatic power been used so ineffectively as in Vietnam. If after all of this time and all of this sacrifice and all of this support, there is still no end in sight, then I say the time has come for the American people to turn to new leadership, not tied to the policies and mistakes of the past. I pledge to you, we shall have an honorable end to the war in Vietnam.
Nixon's plan was initially to Vietnamize the war. American troops were to withdraw from Vietnam. North and South Vietnam should once again settle the conflict among themselves. At the same time, the new president was escalating the conflict elsewhere. In order to avoid losing any more soldiers on the ground, Nixon ordered carpet bombing.
Nixon couldn't afford to continue the war, and he didn't. He changed strategy, withdrew troops, and at the same time intensified the war. In an effort to end the war, as he said honorably, the blood toll had risen once again.
But it soon became clear that the morale of the American combat troops was dropping dramatically. The remaining ground troops doubted the point of their mission. Drug use became a problem, as did assaults against comrades, and there was still no peace in sight. At that point, politicians and the military had lost all confidence in their credibility.
We were constantly being told that we were on the verge of victory. Victory is just around the corner. So you began to get all that rhetoric of how, and as the rhetoric grew and became, more and more optimistic, and contrasted with the war dragging on without any sign of victory, you had what we began to call, the reporters began to call the credibility gap, the difference between the public statements and the reality of what was going on. And we began to realize that the people who were making those statements were lying. They weren't telling the truth.
By the end of 1969, it was again photos that showed the world the horror in Vietnam. In the village of My Lai, U.S. soldiers massacred some 500 civilians. Army photographer Ron Haberly had taken pictures with a personal camera. One of the few survivors of the massacre remembers.
They pushed us into this ditch, all mixed up, the old and the young. There were so many of them. We didn't know what to expect, and suddenly they started shooting. I was so scared. At first I heard voices, children calling for their father or mother, and then it became very quiet. I didn't know at that moment who was already dead and who was still alive.
The massacre took place shortly after the Tet Offensive and made a lie of the often propagated moral superiority of the U.S. soldiers. Without the press reports, the public would never have known about it. At the time, only one person had dared to help the villagers, helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson. He had witnessed the murder from his helicopter. When he spoke about it later in the U.S., he was called a scumbag and a liar. Americans only publicly acknowledged Thompson's courage 30 years after the massacre. The gruesome crime will remain in public memory forever.
102 villagers was killed right in here. We heard the machine guns firing. He says, my God, we'd asked for help for those people. And
because some of them were still alive. They were bleeding out in the ditch.
We took off and broke that way. Glenn heard the machine gun firing. Glenn said, my God, they're firing into the ditch.
And that's when he got the visual on the little child. And then we went back to help the people get out of the bunker. And then, because the child could sort of be put on hold because the Americans were gone by then we got back to try to help the child.
One of the main perpetrators of the massacre in My Lai and other surrounding villages was Lieutenant William Calley, then 25 years old. He and 5 other men stood trial before a military tribunal. Calley was convicted, but pardoned after angry protests. Photographer Philip Jones Griffiths is drawn back to Vietnam again and again. He hopes for a more honest approach to dealing with the past.
The reason I'm always kind of apprehensive about coming here is that My Lai has been elevated to the exception, whereas in fact it was the rule. And, well, it's good that people do know what happened here, but still, it should never cloud the fact that it happened everywhere.
Let us go to the map again.
In April 1970, President Nixon announced the invasion of neutral Cambodia by troops to a surprised nation. The goal was to destroy the retreats and supply routes of the Viet Cong. When Nixon appeared before the press, the facts had long since been established. The mission had been prepared in secret for a long time. A few months earlier, during the election campaign, the president had promised peace with honor. The measure had been met with great disapproval in large parts of the population. A few days later, a mass rally at Kent State University got out of control. The National Guard tried to push the demonstrators back with tear gas. Shortly afterwards, shots were fired. 4 people died and at least 9 were seriously injured. The massacre triggered protests around the world. In the U.S., the largest student strike in the country's history took place, with around 8 million participants. Nixon again addressed the nation.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Their protests I am concerned about. I am concerned because I know how deeply they feel. But I know that what I have done will accomplish the goals that they want. It will shorten this war. It will reduce American casualties. It will allow us to go forward with our withdrawal program. The 150,000 Americans that I announced for withdrawal in the next year will come home on schedule. And it will, in my opinion, serve the cause of a just peace in Vietnam.
U.S. troops were withdrawn from Cambodia within a month, but in Vietnam, the war from the air continued almost unabated. Again and again, alleged Viet Cong positions were bombed with napalm. a combustible, sticky mass that was dropped in canisters or barrels with detonators. Around 400,000 tons were dropped on Vietnam. In June 1972, Vietnamese-American photographer Nick Ut witnessed a misguided attack on a village northwest of Saigon. The consequences were dramatic. As soon as the smoke cleared, injured and frightened civilians from the village stumbled toward the photographers who had gathered there in anticipation of spectacular pictures. Nick Ut succeeded in taking one of the most famous photos of the Vietnam War. A little girl was running for her life. Her name, Kim Phuc.
When I took the Kim Phuc, she run a highway, she the naked, with all the whole family, brother and cousin, and she running. Her body burned so badly bad. I said, "Oh my God, I want she die." That's why I light out my camera on the highway and put water in her body, try to help her. Then I bring her to the hospital to save her life. After I go back to Saigon, develop all my film. Then the picture channel in New York right away after 5-10 minutes, and picture front page next day, everywhere in the war. And after the people saw the picture, you see the picture anti-war out of Vietnam and Washington, everywhere. They hold the picture Kim Phuc doing the anti-war in Vietnam, this photo.
After tough secret diplomacy and several billion-dollar payments, a ceasefire agreement between North and South Vietnam was agreed to in Paris in January of 1973. For the U.S., peace with honor had finally been achieved. America had freed itself from Vietnam and brought its boys home. When the prisoners of war were also released, Congress and the public closed the chapter on Vietnam for the time being. The agreement that was supposed to bring peace to the country was broken countless times in the years that followed. As before, it was the civilians who suffered. They were still caught between North and South Vietnam. Barely 2 years after the Treaty of Paris, the 30-year struggle for power in Vietnam finally came to an end. On the 1st of May, 1975, Hanoi's troops entered Saigon. Vietnam was reunited under a communist flag. A triumph that cost millions of lives.
In the fall of Saigon in 1975, from my office window, I watched a communist infantry company come into this particular park and maneuver and have the last firefight of the war against the town hall, which is just down the end of the street. And we watched them shooting out. We got pictures of them right in front of our eyes in the last battle. It was astounding, of course, to see the war actually come to the heart of the city.
Arnett's account of the fall of the last U.S. bastion in Vietnam, the American Embassy, would later win awards. But before that, the mission was the last refuge for many former employees of the Americans.
Some people in the group, but American and Marine Corps around this town and war, they don't want this people in this to so foreign inside is American embassy and even roof. They have to some lost people. They want to win this in roof. They running away for the helicopter from Marine Corps ship.
Few South Vietnamese had the chance to leave the country with their former allies.
Everyone was very afraid at the time. So was I, because nobody knew what was going to happen. The city was full of soldiers, South Vietnamese, who had fled from the front to the city. Everybody was afraid. We had heard that the Viet Cong would rip out the nails of women with long or painted fingernails, and that anyone who worked for foreigners would be treated badly. My boss had always said he would help us out of here, so I hid in the NBC office.
The television pictures of the hasty retreat of the last Americans and their former allies from Saigon went around the world and once again rattled the image of the U.S. For the former guardian of Vietnam, the experience of losing the war there remains a trauma that lingers to this day, as does the myth that the media ended the war.
The idea that the media ended the Vietnam War is convenient for all sides, and it helps everyone's self-image if they accept and believe that myth. But the consequences, of course, were devastating, because in the aftermath, it meant politicians and military leaders could say with regard to Vietnam, as George Bush Sr. said, in Vietnam we had to fight with one hand behind our back. Now we're not going to do that. So we're going to put in place a rigid media policy that makes sure that you guys, that is the media, can't interfere with us in the successful conduct of a war.
Der erfolgreichen Führung eines Krieges.